An evening with Mr. Durant Ashmore.
Well, I appreciate everybody being here. It's a nice crowd. We're going to be talking about the Cherokees tonight, Cherokee history, the impact that the Cherokees had on the Revolutionary War here in the back country of South Carolina. Now, I'll mention to you that I don't know everything about Cherokees, and I'll be the first one to tell you that. I know a lot about them, but there's several things that I'm still yearning to understand. I've been studying the Cherokees for quite some time, several decades, I guess you would say. I wrote my thesis for landscape architecture from the University of Georgia on Cherokee medicinal uses of plants. So, I studied a fair amount of Cherokee history and culture at that time. The site of my thesis was the Chief Van House in Spring Place, Georgia. Chief Van was the richest Cherokee Indian chief. He had 1,000 acres of a plantation, and he had 1,000 Negro slaves. So, I will be talking a little bit more about Chief Van later on, because that's at the latter or the end of the Cherokee period. The first mention of Cherokees, the first interaction that the Cherokees had, was in 1540 with Hernando de Soto. I know you know about him. Hernando de Soto was looking for a city of gold, and he left from Florida and traveled up through Georgia, through the Columbia area, up into the upstate of South Carolina. And he had 3 priests who were traveling with him, and these priests kept journals of the visit. And the first time that Cherokee interaction comes with the Europeans was when these priests were describing the Cherokee, Chiriqui. That's how they spell it. There could not have been worse ambassadors for European culture than the Spaniards. These people were truly evil. Now, I'm not a Cherokee apologist. The Cherokees did some terrible things. Good Cherokees, they're bad Cherokees. They're good Europeans, they're bad Europeans. What I'm going to be discussing tonight is a clash of cultures. I'm going to be talking about 2 peoples that had no understanding of the ideas and the traditions of the other people. It was bound to be that there was a terrible strife between the Cherokees and the Europeans, particularly up through the Revolutionary War period. Now, after the Revolutionary War, a little bit of a different picture, and I have pretty serious problems with what happened after that time. But as far as early Cherokee history is concerned, these 3 priests described Cherokee culture to an extent. They found agricultural people. The Cherokees were farmers. We don't know exactly when the Cherokee came into this area. Some accounts have said 650 AD. Some accounts have said as late as 1650 AD. In general, we think that the Cherokees arrived here in this area about 1400 AD. The Cherokees are an Iroquois-based society. They came down from the Ohio Valley area. We think that they were pushed south, escaping whatever was going on at that time in the Ohio Valley. And they settled in a 5-state area: western South Carolina, North Carolina, western Georgia, eastern Tennessee, western Virginia. The Cherokees were one of the 5 southern tribes All these tribes started with C: Catawba, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and
Shawnee.
no, not Shawnee. That started with C. Choctaw, thank you, appreciate that. And the Cherokees were said to be the biggest of those tribes. So when Hernando de Soto came in, the Cherokees were terrified of the conquistadors, and they were especially terrified of the horses. That was a creature that they had never seen before. And even more terrifying was the fact that every time the Spanish came to a town, the first thing they would do would be destroy the corn supply that the Cherokees had laid up for the winter. As the Cherokees harvested their corn, they dug holes in the ground, put a basket in there, filled that with the corn that was to supply them through the winter. And that was the first thing that the Spaniards did, was dug up those caches of corn and feed it to the horses, leaving the Cherokee without food for the rest of the winter. Other thing that the Spaniards did was they gave the Native American tribes all throughout this area, they gave them blankets at night. These blankets were infected with smallpox. Now, whether this was intentional or not is up to debate, but based on everything else they did, you would think that it could have been intentional. And European diseases absolutely decimated the Native American population with the English and the Spanish and the French and everybody else. They just could not tolerate the diseases that the Europeans brought with them. And it is said that 90% of the Native American population passed away due to disease. At one time, the Catawbas were down to just 100 individuals. So, this was a horrible thing. That was mostly unintentional, but that is something that really hurt the Native American population. So, Hernando Soto passed through. He went through Tennessee, he crossed the Mississippi, he drowned in the Mississippi. He had started out with 600 men. So his group made it down to the Gulf Coast and then followed the coast back to Florida. And there were about 100 left by the time they got back. And I believe the 3 priests made it because we do have their journals. After that, the English settled. They settled Charleston in 1670, Charlestown Landing, and the English started, their settlements. And about the aristocratic rice planters and so forth, the plantations that were there. There were some conflicts with the Native American tribes, in particular the Yamasee, who were the coastal Indians. They had some conflicts going on with the original planters and so forth. Even though the Yamasee tried to be allies with and friendly, but there was always friction that would go on. The Yamasee, to a certain extent, wanted to supply the British colonists at that time, wanted to supply them with Creek and Cherokee slaves. But that didn't work out too good. And the Spaniards found out early on that Native Americans made very poor slaves. And the reason for this was the first chance that any Native American had to kill their master, that's what they did. Didn't matter what the repercussion might be. You could take him in irons, put him out in the field, take his irons off so he could start plowing. The first thing they would do was kill their master. So they realized early on that Native Americans made poor slaves. There were some Native Americans that were shipped down to the West Indies as slaves, but not too many. And slavery for the Native Americans really never quite happened. So the Yamasee were next to the Charleston aristocracy, planters and so forth. There was friction. there was a war. The Yamasee War in 1715 occurred. And it's a poorly documented war, and it was kind of a crazy thing. And it wasn't just between the Yamasee and the settlers. There were several plantations burned, and the inhabitants were killed, and that sort of thing. But it turned into an uprising all along the East Coast. There were as many as 20 different tribes involved. Cherokees were involved. Creeks were involved. Sometimes the Cherokees would be allied with the Creeks in certain cases. Other times the Cherokees would be fighting the Creeks. It was just a wild and brutal time at that time. Yamasee, as a result of this, were run out of the territory. They went down to the Everglades, and that's where they wound up. But that upset the settlers quite a bit. So they realized that they had, an Indian problem. Along with this, in 1735 was the Stono Rebellion. This was a slave uprising where 25 whites and 50 Negro slaves were killed. So this is another unsettling time for the colonists. And they realized that they had problems with the Indians, they had potential problems with the slaves. So, this was a real cause for concern. And they started forming militias as a result of this to keep the peace. Also, they started bringing in additional settlers from, like Pennsylvania, coming down the Great Wagon Road, new settlers from Ireland and Scotland, Germany, and they started giving land grants to these folks into the back country as a barrier between the low country planters. I was at Musgrove Mill a couple of weeks ago, and the ranger there referred to these settlers as meat shields. I never thought of it that way. It's kind of scary. But this is what they were regarded as. They were a buffer between the Charlestown aristocracy and the wild Indians in the back country. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about Cherokee culture at this time. What kind of tribal law existed with the Cherokees, and also a little bit about Cherokee religion, which I will say I have a poor understanding of. I know that the Cherokees believed in heaven, earth, and hell the way we did. That's about the only comparison between the two religions. But just imagine talking to the Cherokee and saying, hey, we have a Savior who was born as a result of a virgin birth. And can you imagine how silly that would sound to somebody? Our Savior, after he was dead and in a tomb for 3 days, rose from the dead. Well, that's a preposterous thing to say. But just as preposterous to the English settlers were all these myths and legends of the Cherokee. Two cultures that did not understand each other. And then also Cherokee tribal law, which was based on the clan system. In the Cherokee culture, there were 7 different clans. There's the Paint clan, the Bird clan, the Wolf clan, and so on. The warriors came from the Wolf clan. The shamans or medicine men came from the Paint clan. The messengers came from the Bird clan. For every town that there was, and because the Cherokees were agricultural in nature, they had sedentary towns. There were 16 towns in South Carolina. These were in Oconee and Pickens County. There were no Cherokee towns in Anderson or Greene County, but this was Cherokee hunting land. And it was sacred to the Cherokees, and if they found somebody on their hunting ground, like a Catawba, that fellow was in for a rough time. That was what they would do. the boundary line between the Cherokees and the Catawbas was said to be the Broad River. So with these 7 clans, clan law existed. The Cherokees did not have property rights. It was a communal society. If you killed a deer and your neighbor was hungry, everybody shared in the deer. One of the few crimes that would be in Cherokee tradition and life was murder. So if somebody from the Paint clan killed somebody from the Bird clan had the right to kill whoever it was that committed the murder. But say the murderer left and went up to Virginia, or who knows where, then the Bird clan had the right to kill anybody they wanted in the Paint clan. And once that death occurred, justice was served. So clans maintained the order in the Cherokee society. The Cherokee society was a matrilineal society. You belonged to the clan of your mother. Fathers did not raise their sons. Sons were raised by the mother's brothers, by your uncles. That way you were raised according to that clan. If you were in the Paint clan, which was the clan of the shamans, your uncles would teach you about medicinal plants. A woman could divorce her husband at the slightest whim. All she had to say was, hit the road, buddy, and that was it. Y'all like that, do you? But that's the way it was. Women had a certain place in society, and I'm not saying it was equality or anything like that, but they had their roles in society. For instance, during the tribal meetings, there was always the most respected woman for each clan was referred to as beloved woman. And every time that there was a communal meeting, they would go into a lodge house, totally dark in there, pitch black. There'd be a fire in the center. And in the lodge house where decisions were made, whoever spoke the least had the most influence. Whoever spoke last had the most influence. And that was kind of their tradition. But there wasn't a centralized form of government, period. So if there are 100 people in a certain town, and they have a meeting in their townhouse, and 95 of those people decide that they want to have peace and make peace with the English or whoever, but 5 young bucks decide that they want to go on the warpath and prove their manhood, then there was nobody to stop them. That's just what they did. If you broke certain clan laws, the punishment, if it wasn't so serious they killed you, then the punishment would be shunned, and nobody would speak to you. And that would be no fun with nobody in the whole community speaking to you. That was about the only other form of punishment that there was. There would be a war chief usually, and a peace chief. In any town, a healthy town was a town that had all 7 clans represented. And one of the beauties of this clan system, of this matrilineal system, was that there would never be incest. That's one thing that this system ensured, that you wouldn't have to worry about that. So that was the way things were in Cherokee culture when Europeans started encroaching upon their land. And again, that led to a lot of friction. When the Europeans first started settling South Carolina, the Cherokees became dependent upon the British. They liked axes and pots and pans and guns. They wound up where they needed these for survival. And what did the British get out of this? What they got was deer skins and medicinal plants. So deer skins were a very valuable commodity then. 50,000 deer skins a year left from Charleston Harbor to go to Europe, and that doesn't count domestic use of the deer skins. Also, the Cherokees harvested a plant called pink root or worm grass. This is a medicinal plant that was sent down to the West Indies, Barbados and so forth, because the slaves there who were harvesting sugarcane had developed worms. So they were sending this plant down to the West Indies to cure the slaves so they could be more productive in the sugarcane that they produced, and the resulting rum, which was very important. Friction after friction. But the Cherokees became friendly with the British. They needed the British. The British told them, we're going to stop European advancement beyond the Appalachian Mountains. So they liked that quite a bit. And the British said it is illegal. In 1739, they passed a law that said it's illegal for any person of European descent to be in Cherokee territory. And that sounded great. They liked that. The problem was they never defined where the Cherokee territory was. And that wasn't resolved until 1760 in the Treaty of Augusta, when the line between Greenville County and Lawrence County and Anderson County and Abbeville County was established. This is the southernmost boundary of Greenville County, was established in 1760, and it was the Indian boundary line. And of course, you know about the sign on Highway 418, those of you who are from here in Simpsonville, that's defining where the Cherokee Indian boundary line was. It ran between Fountain Inn and Simpsonville. This was Cherokee territory. It was illegal for any man or person of European descent to be here. Richard Parris was here, moved here in 1770. He was here illegally. He actually got arrested for that. But his property wound up in the hands of his son George, who was half Cherokee. Apparently, Richard Parris's wife was Cherokee. So the British, the Cherokees, allies of the British. At the same time, the French were trying to make the Cherokees allies. And the French in the Ohio Valley and the Spaniards in Florida wanted to curry the favor of the Cherokees. But the Cherokees sided with the British and fought with the British in the French and Indian War. 300 Cherokee warriors fought with George Washington in the French and Indian War when he took Fort Duquesne, which is now Pittsburgh. And then later on, a year or two after that, Cherokees were scouting in Virginia for another military leader, and that was a successful expedition. The Cherokees, there may have been 50 or 100 of them. They rode their horses up to Virginia. They scouted out. They did their job. They were returning home. Well, before they were still in Virginia at the time, and they camped, and they woke up one morning and all their horses were stolen. So immediately they start talking to the Europeans. Who stole our horses? Who stole our, you know? We don't know who stole your horses. Well, what clan were they? What clan were the people who stole our horses? Clan? We don't got no clan. We're all the same clan. Okay, you're all the same clan. So, according to tribal law, that clan is supposed to supply the horses that got stolen. So the Cherokees stole 30 or 40 horses themselves and got on them and started riding down to South Carolina, the back country of South Carolina. Well, the people in North Carolina who had the horses stolen, they weren't too happy about that. So they attacked the Cherokees who were riding their stolen horses and killed about 20 or 25 of them. Cherokees didn't like that, so they killed 25 people in North Carolina. By that time, you know, the remaining Cherokees made it back to their towns and so forth. But this is just one of hundreds of examples of how Cherokee law and European law were in such a conflict and what kind of misunderstandings this led to. So, about 1758, the British put an embargo on the Cherokees and wouldn't give them muskets and shot and powder and pots and pans. So the Cherokees sent a delegation down to Charleston of about 25 chiefs under a white flag. Now that was one thing that the Cherokees recognized from European culture as well, is that a white flag was a peace flag. And the Cherokees went down to Charleston, and the British government said, you know, you've got to give us the 25 Indians who killed the 25 settlers in North Carolina. You've got to do this, and once you do this, the you know, we'll start supplying you again with the materials you need. So the Cherokees were like, okay, well, we'll go back and we'll talk to our friends there. And so they went back to Kiowee, and that was the capital of the lower town. The Cherokees had the lower town, which was the 16 towns in South Carolina, the middle town, which is like the mountains, and then the over mountain group, three distinct groups. During the French and Indian War, the British constructed 2 forts in Cherokee territory. And the Cherokees welcomed this because they thought that that would help as far as the Creek Indians were concerned. And also it was to keep the French incursions out. So these 2 forts, Fort Prince George in Kiowee, which is now at the bottom of Lake Kiowee, and Fort Loudon, which is, or Loudon, whichever it is, in Tennessee. On the way back to Fort Prince George to, you know, discuss the terms of the peace settlement, the British escort decided that they're going to capture the 25 Cherokee chiefs and hold them as hostages until 20 Cherokees were turned over who were guilty of murder. And these Cherokee chiefs were kept in a small room in Fort Prince George for weeks on end. 5 of them died of smallpox while they were there. The Cherokees were not happy about this. They surrounded the fort. They besieged the fort. But the British did have enough supplies to withstand that siege for a while. So they asked the leader of the fort, the head of the fort, Lieutenant Coitmore, to come out and parley with them, talking about, you know, a peace settlement. So Lieutenant Coitmore went out to talk to the Cherokees. Well, unbeknownst to him, there were Cherokees in ambush, hidden, and they shot and they killed Lieutenant Coitmore. They violated the white flag, the truce flag. The soldiers inside the fort, once they saw that happen, they murdered the hostages. So this was the start of the first Cherokee War, the Anglo-Cherokee War, 1758 to 1761. The British sent a force under Archibald Montgomery to burn the Cherokee towns. He was going through a narrow pass in North Carolina. He got ambushed. His force was defeated. It's one of the few Cherokee victories. But the British, they weren't going to have any of that, so they sent General James Grant with a huge force through that just really wiped out the Cherokees at that time and forced them into the mountains. And that was the end of the first Cherokee War. And it did not end well for the Cherokees. Now, during this time, the leaders of the future Revolutionary War were heavily involved in this Indian fight. Francis Marion, Andrew Pickens, Thomas Sumter, Moses Kirkland, Thomas Fletchall. These were military leaders who fought the Indians. They were experienced Indian fighters. Anybody here in the backcountry at that time had experience fighting with the Indians. The settlers here built forts all throughout the area. Every 10 miles, every 20 miles, there would be blockhouses. There was blockhouse after blockhouse around here. Down Fairview Road, on Knickerbocker Road, it's about 6 or 8 miles out of town. There was a Kellett blockhouse. Joseph Kellett was a prominent landowner here. He built a blockhouse for protection. That was just one of many. So the threat of Indians was paramount to the settlers during this entire time. And the bravery of these settlers is something that is really striking, because every night that these people went to sleep, they never knew if there was going to be a flaming arrow come land in the roof of their cedar shingles. It was a constant fear that there was going to be an Indian battle, an Indian uprising. The first Cherokee War calmed things down for a few years, but then it started building up again. And when the Revolutionary War did break out, again, the British curried the favor of the Cherokees. They fought together. But it was a major civil war here in the back country. Half the settlers back here were loyalists, half the settlers were patriots. Moses Kirkland and Thomas Fletchall, who were so prominent in the first Cherokee War, putting that down, they were loyalists. Andrew Pickens, who also had a big role in that first Cherokee War, he was a patriot. As I've been studying and so forth, reading about American history, one fella has really come to the fore as being one of the most brave and honorable men of all, and that is Andrew Pickens. I cannot talk enough about the great things that he did. He was an Indian fighter. He killed a lot of Cherokees, but he was highly respected by the Cherokees. And I'm going to be talking about him a little bit later. He established treaties with the Cherokees. They fully respected him. He kept his word. They gave him the nickname of Skyagунska, which meant Wizard Owl, which was quite an honor for him at that time. During the Revolutionary War, it's important to understand there are two different periods in the Revolutionary War. The first period, from 1775 to 1780, is the American period. And that American period was dominated by the struggles with the Cherokees. In May of 1780, Charlestown fell to the British, Cornwallis and so forth. Totally changed everything that happened. The South Carolina government was abolished. I mean, the governor fled to North Carolina. Henry Lawrence, they named Lawrence County after him. He was head of the Council of Safety. He was imprisoned. He was sent to the Tower of London. Nobody was in charge. Andrew Pickens surrendered because there was nobody to fight for. Andrew Pickens' general, Andrew Williamson, he went over to the British side. He's referred to as the South Benedict Army. Robert Anderson, who Anderson County is named after, who was under Williamson, under Pickens, he was a captain, he surrendered. So it was just, a huge sea change at that time. But before Charleston fell, in 1776, there was another Indian uprising. In June of 1776, there was the Hampton Massacre. This is Wade Hampton's great-grandparents. They had a homestead on the Tiger River. There was one lady who was out in the woods, and she saw everything that happened. An Indian chief came up, was shaking the hand of Wade Hampton's great-grandfather, shaking his hand with one hand and hitting him in the head with a tomahawk on the other. There were 8 homesteaders killed at that time. An infant baby was swung by the ankles and had his head bashed in against the side of the house. The woman who saw this was so terrified, she never spoke for the rest of her life. That's the way the story goes. There was an 8-year-old boy who was kidnapped. The Cherokees, if there was a child between the age of 5 and 10, they would not kill them, but they would kidnap them and bring them into the tribe. Younger than 5, they were too much trouble. Older than 10, they would be trouble too. 8 from 5 to 10, they were brought into the tribe. And 2 years afterwards, Andrew Pickens negotiated a truce with the Cherokees, and one of the conditions was that they would give up all their hostages. So this young boy, he was supposed to go with Andrew Pickens, and he refused. He wanted to stay with the Cherokees. So I don't know what the whole story is there. Eventually, he did go with the Europeans. But in this area, at the Kellett Blockhouse, 5 or 6 miles from here, there was a fellow named William Brown who was stationed there. And he was stationed with about 50 or 100 other militiamen. He was there for just a few months. And his job, while he was stationed at the Kellett Blockhouse, was to go out into the surrounding countryside and bury victims of the Cherokees. 31. And this is within 10 or 20 miles of the Kellett Blockhouse. In the few months that he was a militiaman stationed there, they buried 31 women and children and settlers who had been scalped by the Indians. That's how bad it was then. You would think that the most valuable scalp would be from the biggest and strongest man that you killed, but that's not the way the Indians looked at it. The most valuable scalps were the women and the children. And the reason for that is if you penetrated the enemy territory so far that you killed their women and children, then you really had done something. We don't think that way, but that's the way the thinking was then. So, during the Second Cherokee War of 1776, Andrew Williamson, he chastised, that was the term that was used, he chastised the Cherokees. And Andrew Pickens was with him, Robert Anderson was with him. They burned every town they came to. They shot the horses, cows, and pigs. They destroyed the cornfields. They totally decimated the Cherokees and drove them into the mountains for the cold winter months. And they were literally living in rags with no protection. And that was pretty much the end of worrying about serious Cherokee deprivations at that point. Andrew Pickens negotiated the Treaty of DeWitt's Corner, which in modern days we know as Due West, South Carolina. Somehow or another, pronunciation from DeWitt's Corner changed to Due West. Due West ain't Due West of nothing. If you go due east from due west, you don't hit anything until you hit Spain. But that's just the way they changed things. The Cherokees were relegated to just a sliver of South Carolina, just a 5-mile strip. And that was it. But Andrew Pickens negotiated 2 treaties after the war was over. And these were the Hopewell treaties. His plantation was, he named it Hopewell. And he negotiated a treaty with the Cherokees so, everybody would live in peace and we would stay out of Cherokee territory. And he negotiated a treaty with the Creeks as well. They were down in Georgia. They were harder to deal with. And the Creeks really were much more loosely organized than even the Cherokees. That's just a term that the Europeans gave a bunch of Indians that lived, near the waterways. The Seminoles were Creeks. The Chickamaugas were Creeks. Anyway, they were hard to deal with because the Spaniards dealt with the Creeks, and you had all these competing interests at the time. But it was next to impossible to maintain these treaties. Now, due to Pickens' influence, South Carolina was true to their word, even though they ran them out of South Carolina, basically. But the people in North Carolina, they encroached on Cherokee lands. People in Georgia, Tennessee, made it even worse. There was this guy named John Sevier in Western Virginia at that time, which was part of Tennessee. He decides he's going to start his own state, and he calls it Franklin, the state of Franklin. Well, it was right in the middle or on the border of territory that Pickens had promised to the Cherokees up in that area. But John Sevier comes in and he camps out there. Cherokees killed 5 members of the Kirk family because they were encroaching on their lands. Well, John Sevier, he wasn't going to have any of that, so he went and he killed 90 Cherokees. This is just the kind of things that happen time after time after time. But finally, things started to settle down a little bit. And the idea was, look, Cherokees, if you just adopt white man ways, you're going to be all right. And the Cherokees did. They became known as the civilized tribe. They brought in missionaries. The Moravians came down to Cherokee land. Christianizing. The Cherokees became Christian. They kept their own religion as well. They developed a democratic form of government. They developed a bicameral legislature. They established a capital in New Echota in the western part of Georgia. And if you go between Atlanta and Chattanooga, you can go visit New Echota. And you can see the kind of community that they had there. Sequoia developed a Cherokee syllabary. They had their own written language. Sequoia produced a newspaper, half of it would be in English, the other half would be in Cherokee. They did everything they could to become like the white man. About this time, James Vann comes into the story, and this is where, I wrote my thesis on his plantation in Spring Place, Georgia. Now, James Vann was a rogue. He was a murderer. He was as bad a guy as you can possibly imagine. What he did was he got 12 drunk Indians together and called them chiefs and signed over permission to the federal government to run a road from Athens, Georgia up into Tennessee. It was called the Federal Road. And all along this road, he established ferries and taverns and gambling houses and houses of ill repute and you name it. And every time somebody traveled that federal road, he got the profits from whatever it was they were doing. He built a mansion in Spring Place, Georgia. He brought in a builder from New England. It's an incredible mansion, and it's still standing. It's worth seeing. It was 4 rooms, two below, 2 above, huge rooms. He could have balls in these rooms. Beautiful, fine workmanship. The bricks were made right on the property there. And I told you he had 1,000 slaves. He had 1,000 slaves. He was a very wealthy man. There was a 5th room in this mansion, and it was down below. It wasn't a cellar, it was a dungeon. And he mistreated his slaves terribly. But I can tell you some stories about that. But anyway, he was a leading agriculturalist. He brought in scientists, if you will, to talk about how to, grow crops. He had peach trees, he had hogs, he had corn, he had whiskey stills, which he sold, at his taverns. Right next to his house, there was another tavern, which was bigger than his house, but it was a rough clapboard building. But that was like an inn. That's where travelers were on the federal road and stayed. The federal road passed 50 feet in front of his front door. But he was making hand over fist. But he was a murderer, and he died by murder. He died in 1809. He was shot in one of his taverns, and nobody ever bothered to find his killer. They were glad to see him gone. His son took over. And his son was called Rich Joe, and he wasn't nearly as bad. He was a little bit of a wild character. He was a riverboat gambler, but he wasn't anything like his father. But Chief Vann brought in Arabian missionaries who built schools, who educated the Cherokees. The missionary's wife, Anna Rosina Gambold, she was an incredible botanist, and this is sort of what I based my thesis on. She communicated with all the leading botanists in Europe, Linnaeus and so forth, and she sent a herbarium, a 1,400 specimen herbarium, to the universities in England, and she was quite well known. So, as bad as Chief Vann was, he did some good things. The Cherokees continued to be allies with the American government. They became like the American government. They came, democratized. They fought with the American government, especially during the War of 1812. They sided with the famous general during that time, Andrew Jackson. they fought with him at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. They fought against the Creeks, you know, and this had a lot to do with it. They hated the Creeks. Anytime they had a chance to fight the Creeks, they were going to take advantage of that. The Creeks were fighting Andrew Jackson, and they had a camp on a river in Alabama that was at a horseshoe bend in one of those rivers. And the Creeks built a breastworks across the neck of that horseshoe. It was out of brush, 6 feet high, that sort of thing. Andrew Jackson, he had a couple of cannons, he starts blasting away, but it was really kind of a standoff. But the Creeks, had a plan that if things got too hot for them, they were going to jump in their canoes and go on down the river and fight another day. So they had 600 canoes tied up on the bank at this horseshoe bend. Well, the Cherokees knew that, and they saw that. The Cherokees swam across the river, got in the Creek canoes, and kept the Creeks from escaping. Andrew Jackson eventually blasted through that breastworks with his cannons and slaughtered everybody who was there, 660 people. How do we know this? They cut the noses off the dead people, put them in baskets, and then counted the noses. So, folks, I've been taking it easy on you talking about I could go on and on. But they gathered all kinds of things for Andrew Jackson. And they were getting along pretty well, doing fine, until about 1832 comes along, and gold is found in western Georgia. So much gold that the United States government set up a mint in Dahlonega to mint all this gold that was found. Well, we can't have Cherokees living on our land full of gold. So, the movement started to take the Cherokees' land and march them to Oklahoma. We can't have heathens in our western lands, especially if there's gold. So this is what started. This is what started the Trail of Tears. The Cherokees were rounded up, 16,000 of them. They were rounded up and they were put in concentration camps. And they were forced to march on the Trail of Tears, 1,500 miles. 4,000 died on this route. Who's responsible for the Trail of Tears? Andrew Jackson, their ally. He's president now in 1838. It was against the law for him to do that. The Supreme Court said, you can't force this removal. And Andrew Jackson said John Marshall made that law. Now let's see him enforce it. And he didn't. He made. And by the way, this is the portrait that's hanging in the White House now. Andrew Jackson, the guy who stabbed the Cherokees in the back. And that was except for a 10 square mile area in western North Carolina, that is the eastern band of the Cherokee Indians, that is the end of Cherokees east of the Mississippi River. Does anybody have any questions? I'd love to answer questions. Yes?
It's not the question, it's just something that seems kind of ironic that today so many people claim Cherokee heritage. Isn't that a little ironic?
I don't know.
To a certain extent, and how bad they were treated.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of intermarriage.
Yeah,
There was a lot of intermarriage. Anybody Anybody else?
You ever hear of a chief named Roy Toy?
Yes, yeah, Moitoy was a war chief. He started a few ruckuses. He may have ended a few as well. Are you related to Moitoy? Speak out. We have a answer here. Moitoy. Now, Moitoy was a bad dude. Yes.
How did the Cherokee influence a way of fighting, for instance, you see like in the movie Patriot, how he moves and seamlessly, especially with various weapons that he does. Did they directly or indirectly influence the way that the people in the frontier fought, both against them and also encroachments on their own
That's a
property?
great question. I appreciate you asking that. See, our great militia leaders, Sumter, Pickens, and Marion, were guerrilla fighters. They were Indian fighters, and they fought. They did not have pitched battles. They had a few pitched battles, but they used those techniques, hit and run, and that's where they learned them. Yes.
How did the Eastern Band, how were they able to stay behind?
Right. For one, they were isolated in the mountains, but they did have a separate treaty with the state of North Carolina that was honored. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Bryson City, North Carolina, which is close to Cherokee, North Carolina. There was an Indian chief named Tsali, T-S-A-L-I, who some of his, I can't remember exactly what the story is, but there was a murder or something. I don't know that he was necessarily involved in that. He may have been some of the people that worked underneath, but he volunteered himself to be hung in downtown Bryson City so that the rest of his tribe could live in peace. Yes.
We see so much in the movies, we read so much about the Indians use the technique of scalping.
Yes.
Did the Cherokee scalp?
Yes. And then I told you about at the Kelly Blockhouse scalping, 31 people, women and children. Fort Loudon in Tennessee, when the hostages were killed in Fort George, the Indians surrounded Fort Loudon and completely cut it off. It took 3 days to get to Fort Loudon from Fort Prince George. They were absolutely cut off. So, once the soldiers in Fort Loudon had eaten all their horses and had nothing else to eat, they sued for peace. And the Cherokees told them and said, okay, leave all your ammunition, leave everything behind, and you can march out of here. We'll let you do that. And so then the story is that when the Cherokees went into the abandoned fort, they found shot and gunpowder buried that the soldiers had tried to hide from them. So that incensed them, and in their minds, they violated the terms of the treaty or peace that they had, signed up for. So then they massacred those people on the trail. Every soldier died. The head, I guess he was a lieutenant or a colonel, Demir, they scalped him alive. And then they made him dance till he died. And then they stuffed his mouth full of dirt and said, if you love the land so much, here, have all you can eat. So the Cherokees definitely were
Was
scalped.
torture the reason for scalping, or what was the reason for scalping?
It was an honor to have. It was a token. It was an emblem. It was a badge of honor. And again, it was the women and children. Their scalps were the most valuable. It proved that you penetrated, the stronghold of the enemy. And I don't know. I mean, you captured the soul of the person. I don't know how that comes into play.
I do, I will.
Part of the product of that I started up in the northeast where the British were paying the scouts.
Yes, there were bounties,
Yeah.
there were bounties.
So the bounty.
Yeah, there sure were. Yes.
What's the significance of Fort Lindley down on 76?
Yeah.
Outpost or the?
Yeah, Fort Linley's that way. No, now, I'm doing a lot of work in Fort Linley. I love Fort Linley. And I didn't explain this, but William Brown, when he wrote about the burying the dead settlers at Fort Linley, his story continues when he says, while we were there at the fort, burying dead people, we met a Tory. We met a Tory. How nice. How you doing, Mr. Tory? He informed us that that evening, 300 Cherokees and 300 white men dressed as Cherokees, Scofielites, were going to attack Fort Linley. So William Brown and his crew skedaddled down to Fort Linley. It was about 20 some odd miles down in Lawrence County. And when they got there, there was 150 of Lawrence County's finest militiamen camped there in the surrounding field around the fort. And William Brown's militia walked up on these men surrounding the fort. Well, these men surrounding the fort were drunk. They were drunk bad. They were so drunk, they aimed their muskets at the rescuers. What do you mean we're going to get attacked tonight? We ain't going to get attacked tonight. I'm going to shoot you. Finally, the commander, Jonathan Downs, the hero of Lawrence County, he got control of the group, and he brought them inside the fort. There was about 50 settlers in there to begin with. William Brown's group, 50 to 100, plus 150 of Jonathan Downs' men, so now there's 300 in the fort. And by good luck, another group of 300 militiamen were passing through, going to join Andrew Williamson. They were at the fort. So now there's 600 men in Fort Linley. At midnight, the leader of the Tories was James Lindley, who owned the fort. But he was a Tory, and he got run out, and he was living in the wilds of Greenville County at that time. He led a force of 600 against Fort Linley. He had 600 men. And at midnight, Lindley's group surrounded that fort, and they start firing. And the people in the fort start firing back. And after a while of that going on, the people in the fort got tired of that, so they burst through the front doors of the fort in a sally, 10 abreast, and started firing away, and that broke the attack. And the Indians and Scofielites scattered. Now, no bodies were found. A lot of blood was found, but no bodies were found. The next morning, and this is all in William Brown's pension application, the next morning they formed a skirmish line, half a mile wide, and marched out of the fort to see if they could find any survivors or just, what was going on. And about 3 miles away, they came to a clearing where there were 30 horses and saddles and saddlebags and scattered corn, things like that. So they started going through the saddlebags, and they found the commission papers of Captain James Lindley. James Lindley fought at the Battle of the Canebrake. I didn't mention that. Battle of the Canebrake is the only battle to happen in Greenville County. And that happened just a few miles from here, maybe 10 miles, off of Fort Shoals Road on the Reedy River. James Lindley was captured at the Canebrake. Thomas Sumter and Andrew Pickens were involved in that situation. He was marched down to Charleston with 130 other prisoners, including Richard Paris. The Battle of the Canebrake probably lasted 30 minutes. As soon as it was over, it started snowing. and it started snowing a lot. It started snowing so much that there was 30 inches of snow on the ground. And those people were ill prepared for that much snow. But they made the 2-week march down to Charleston, where most of the prisoners were paroled. Richard Parris was thrown in irons and kept in a dungeon for 9 months. James Lenny was paroled with the idea that he would never take up arms again against the Patriot forces. Well, he did take up arms again. He attacked his own fort. But he got away. We don't know what he did for the next 18 months. But later, when Andrew Pickens was around Augusta, Georgia, at the Battle of Kettle Creek, Andrew Pickens had 200 militiamen. He attacked 600 loyalist militiamen and routed them. It was an absolute victory for the Patriots. James Lindley was at Kettle Creek. He was captured at Kettle Creek. He had violated his parole. He was put on trial in '96, found guilty of that, and hung by the neck. That was the end of James Lindley. Yes.
If you haven't been, a few months ago, we went up to Sequoia Birthplace Museum, which has been redone.
Yes. Where is that?
It's right across the road from Fort Loudon.
Oh, and I haven't been to Fort Loudon either.
So you kill a couple of birds with
Yeah.
one stone there. So,
Need to do that, yeah.
apparently they just redone the museum. It's very well done. Beautiful parts.
Great, thank you.
Where's Fort Lauderdale?
Yes.
Oh, is it?
Sorry, can you breathe, because I know everybody wants to go. But Andrew Pickens, I believe, tried to be somewhat of a peacemaker.
I'm sorry?
I believe Andrew Pickens, who he said, we tried to be
Oh,
somewhat of
yes.
a peacemaker.
Yes.
At the end of the Revolutionary War.
Yes.
So up until that point, the problems with the Cherokee, with virtually everybody, were the competing claims for the
Yeah.
land. Who's going to France, Spain, England, who?
Yeah.
So if Andrew Pickens tried to settle things down because he had had enough
Yes,
at the end of the Revolution,
he had.
what would be the nature of the problems up until, of course, the Trail of Tears? What would be the nature of the problem with the Cherokee from that time until, say, the Trail of Tears? Was it, in fact, the nature of the problems in general in the upcountry South Carolina?
Well,
I know they still had spats in one of them, but was it just
in
cooking
upcountry South,
drums or what?
in upcountry South Carolina, there weren't too many problems because they were banished. Now, there was a blockhouse, the last blockhouse, and I talked about the forts. The last blockhouse in South Carolina was at Oconee Station, which is up in Oconee County, the northwest corner of South Carolina. It's a rock blockhouse, and it's worth seeing if you go there. It was from 1792 to 1799 is when it was abandoned. But there were Cherokees in Georgia and in Tennessee and North Carolina. This is, the corner where almost all of those areas come together. And they would come into South Carolina to steal, horses or what have you. And this is something I probably should have mentioned early on. With the Indian depredations, you never knew. It could have been Creeks from Georgia. It could have been Catawbas from North Carolina. It could have been white men dressed as Indians. Now, that was a popular thing to do. At one point, there was a Shawnee raiding party that came down into South Carolina, stole horses, and went back. Well, who gets blamed for that? It's the Cherokees. So, South Carolina created a blockhouse. They manned it with like 30 militiamen. They rode every day to see if there were wayward Indians coming through. There were also trading posts that traded with the Indians. Excuse me. But you never knew when something bad was going to happen. But by 1799, things had calmed down enough to where they just, said, we don't need this blockhouse anymore. And so they stopped it. Then when the Cherokees became civilized, I mean, they had European laws. You could go to court and enforce, you know, the laws and so forth. So, things had settled down. I mean, you had rogues like James Vann, but, if they hadn't found gold, who knows what would have happened. You know, that was the end of it there. Yes.
Could you describe a blockhouse?
Yes, blockhouses were built in several different ways. Usually they were 2 stories. There would be fortified plantations, and the militia in different areas would be started by the leading men of the area. And they would say, come on guys, we're gonna have a drill, come on over. There was always beer or rum or whiskey involved. That came with it. And it was really a chance to get away from the little lady and go shoot your gun for a little bit while you're trying to shoot your gun. But these leading plantations had fortified areas, and sometimes it would be the house. I think at Fort Lindy it was a fortified house. Sometimes there would be separate buildings and so forth. And frequently for these blockhouses there would be 2 stories, loophole for a rifle fire, and there would be cantilevers with the second floor sticking out over the first floor 18 inches or so. So that if somebody came up to the door, you could shoot right down on them. Or you could hit them on the head with a rock or something like that. Frequently you'll see that. You know, and then a few of them were made out of rock. Andrew Dickens had one that was stone. Some of them were small. I mean, at Hayes Station, it was 10 feet wide, about 30 feet long. Joseph Hayes had 18 men in there. He was surrounded by Bloody Bill Cunningham and his 300 men. This is in November of 1781. You think that the war ended with the siege of Yorktown in October of 1781? Well, it didn't. It continued on, especially in South Carolina. Bloody Bill Cunningham went on a raid, just absolutely committing murder. And Joseph Hayes was in his blockhouse with, like I said, 18 men, and they threw, burning ingots onto the roof, and it started burning. So Joseph Hayes and his men surrendered. They said, come out one at a time, put your hands behind your back. And they tied their hands, and then they took a rope, and they tied them all together with that rope. They said, okay, we're gonna march you away. You're our prisoners now. And as soon as all 18 of them were tied, they started hanging them one at a time, or 2 or 3 at a time. Joseph Hayes was the first one to be hung. However, they were hanging them from a fodder pole, and the fodder pole broke. Boy, that made Bloody Bill mad. He hacked them to pieces with his sword, hands tied behind their back. They had to pick those people up with baskets. And they didn't know whose arm belonged to what leg. That's the Revolutionary War was a brutal war. Did not have the Geneva Convention during the Revolutionary War. A lot of innocent men were prisoners of war, let's say, were killed, left and right. It was tough. And that happened right in Lawrence County. That happened about 35 miles from here.
If someone wants to see a blockhouse, they went down here in Gray Court at the Culbertson Village. And it was moved there. It's not the original site, but it was moved there.
Good. I appreciate you bringing that, mentioning that out. Yeah. Because the blockhouses are few and far between. I mean, really none of them staying there. Fort Thickety is it now. I'm doing some work at Fort Thickety as well. But that was probably, Fort Thickety's got some issues, particularly as far as this authenticity. We're running a little over, but I'm happy to answer questions as long as anybody can stick with me. I'm fine with this, yes.
Are there books you recommend on Cherokee?
There are, but I can't recall them right now. And many of the books that I've been reading lately are the history of Thomas Sumter, Francis Marion, and Andrew Dickens. There's an excellent book by Andrew Dickens by Rod Gardner. I highly recommend that book. Yes.
You didn't like midnight. When I was in the Army in 1968, and we were processing this. I had filled in the blanks, birthplace of my mother and all that. And it struck me because the guy said, where's your mother born? And at Bryson City was this place she was born.
Yeah.
And he looked straight at me and said, so you're part Cherokee Indian? Well, I was 6 years old when my grandmother died. And we went to Canton, out in that, probably that 10-mile radius I was talking about.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget as long as I live, because 6 years I was scared to death because everybody looked like a Cherokee Indian at that funeral. And it snowed, and the family plot was on, I can still see it like it was yesterday.
Yeah.
It took them 2 hours to get my granny to the top of the hill. But now that I think back on it, and I think about faces, it was just like, you don't have to be college educated to figure out who looks like an Indian or don't.
Right.
And it terrified me. It just absolutely, I was part Cherokee. So that's why I was so mean growing up.
Now it's a badge of honor. Made you a better soldier.
I gotta testify to that. I'm a survivor.
We appreciate it. Thank you for what you do. Yes.
Grant, you might mention Judicula's Rock.
Well, Judicula's Rock goes back to the Cherokee religion that I don't understand so much. But, I mean, they would see topographical features, and associate mystical properties with these particular spots. And Judicula's Rock, now is that in the, what river is that in?
River. It's on the way to Silva, 107, you come out of.
Well, it looks like a serpent.
Pretty big.
Yeah, a big creature, and how, they talk about creation tales, how the earth was formed, and you look out over the landscape, and it looks like a giant buzzard came through when the earth was soft before it hardened off, and the buzzard settled down, and you can see the form of its wings, in the landscape. And, these are the different, they just associated mystical powers with, everyday features and so forth. But, it's kind of fascinating. Part of their religion was they believed in totally different realms. And you never mixed realms. If you did, that was pollution. And when you cause pollution, bad things were going to happen. The men had specific roles. The women had specific roles. The women were the farmers. The men were the hunters. You wouldn't have a woman out on the hunt. You weren't going to get any game that day because you polluted. They believed in clean and unclean. When a woman had her menstrual period, she was unclean. She went out into the woods for 5 days. Some of you gals may like that. I don't know. Some of you may not. But once, that time was over, she could come back in because she was unclean. That's the way it was looked at. And there were different applications of this. There was the realm of water where the fish lived. There was the realm of air where the birds lived. There was the realm of land where the humans lived. And you would not mix the two. One of the most revered critters or creatures in the Cherokee culture was the water spider. Now, who would think that a water spider was something to revere? But it could live in the realm of land or air and the realm of water. So it had special properties that it could do that. You know, it's just sort of odd or funny how they associate different meanings with different things. But you never mix the two. If you mix the clean and unclean, I mean, a tornado would come, and there's the proof right there. That was part of their culture.
Could you define again the eastern boundary of the Cherokee? I've heard it said that at one time the eastern border was the dividing line between Greenville and Spartanburg County.
Yeah.
But it was it that, or was it say the Broad River, or what do we know about the?
Okay, here it is. So 1739, the British passed a law that no European could live in Cherokee territory, but it never was found in Cherokee territory. So then, what was so important during that time was survey points of reference. You know, it was like the Catawbas were allocated 15 square miles, 225 miles, and it was supposed to be in South Carolina. Well, at that time, the South Carolina-North Carolina line wasn't surveyed, and once they did survey it, they found out that that line goes right through where the Catawbas are supposed to be, so who knows? So the westernmost point that was surveyed in the backcountry at that time, 1760, was DeWitt's Corner, which is due west. So then the law read that no European can be west of the line from DeWitt's Corner that ran southwest to the Savannah River, northeast to the Reedy River, which is just right down there. Now, the western boundary, and that is the southern boundary of Greenville County. The western boundary was not defined at all. That line was established by Lord Tryon, the governor of North Carolina. How did that happen? Now we know where this point is on the Reedy River. That's the Indian boundary line. So he wanted to claim the area west of the Catawba Indian Reservation for North Carolina. The law said that the 35th parallel was supposed to be the dividing line, but Governor Tryon, on his own, decided to draw a line from where the Indian boundary line ended, due north into North Carolina, and it ended on top of a mountain, which is now Mount Tryon. So if you look at the Greenville County, Spartanburg County line, that line goes due north, starting at the Reedy River. It was claimed by Lord Tryon. Well, South Carolina protested, and they went to court over it. And they went to court in London. They had to sail ship all the way over to London, argue the case. 3 years later, a decision comes back. No, you can't do that. So that was the end of that, but it established the western boundary, or the eastern boundary, of the Cherokee territory. And if you look, that line goes due north, it goes right through Greer. But there is a little jog in that line that runs over to the Inner Reedy River that takes in Fountain Inn. Fountain Inn was part of the 96th district at that time. Now it's part of Greenville County. The settlers in the 1790s, the courthouse to Greenville at that time was in Golden Grove community in southern Greenville County. The Lawrence courthouse was further away than the Golden Grove courthouse. So they petitioned the state legislature to cut out a little piece of what is now Spartanburg County, make it part of Greenville County. So you see the line goes due north, then it veers at the Kellett Blockhouse, at the Widow Kellett's house. It veers over to the Inner Reedy, follows the Inner Reedy till it gets back to the line going due north. So the governor of North Carolina decided the borderline between Greenville and Spartanburg County. That's how that happened.
They didn't want to build a wall.
You're in ready, yeah. Well, folks, I can answer questions all night long, but let's see if you folks are restless, so I guess we'll call it an evening. Appreciate it. Thank you.